I held off on doing this type of a video for a long time, ever since I began my channel back in February of 2014. When I first started out, I mentioned that I was going to talk about this book by Geoff Emerick and his ghostwriter Howard Massey, Here, There, and Everywhere. My life recording the music of the Beatles. You can tell by how well I kept the book up what I actually think of it. Now, before I go into some thoughts I have of the book and the whole situation, let me just say that Geoff Emerick, I think, was a great engineer, and I did a brief tribute to him when he passed, unfortunately. He was a very big part of that Beatles period from 1966 to off and on in 68 and finally in 69 with Abbey Road. He was a big part of it. So when he announced that he was going to do a book, I was excited. I was like, he knows where all the bodies are buried, you know? And then I read the book, and I'm sure people who know the issues with the book. Some people defend it, but I'm one of those people that got extremely pissed off by it. He really, as everybody says, beats up George. But then as the book goes on, he beats up John too. George and John, the two Beatles who are no longer here to defend themselves. And Ringo's hardly in the book. First off, I bring this up because of this big controversial lawsuit that's happening between the Emerick estate and the Beatles company Apple concerning what the media is calling a jam session in 1962. Basically, he's holding on to the Beatles audition tape. And the big discrepancy there is that they said he was there, started working at Abbey Road in June of 62 when the Beatles recorded this. But in the book here and in his Wikipedia page, it says that he started working at Abbey Road in September of 62. So, which is it? I have a feeling he worked on the anthology. Somehow the tape wound up in his possession, whatever way possible. I'm not going to speculate as to how. Which brings me to this book. There's a lot of discrepancies in it. Prior to the book coming out, if you read interviews with Geoff Emerick, he really couldn't remember too many details. When this book came out, not only could he remember details, he could remember actual conversations that these guys have said. Actual things, actual dialogue that these guys have said. There's an interview from 1978 that I read. I'm not going to be able to link to it because it's no longer available. At least I wasn't able to find it. But he really couldn't remember much, or maybe he didn't want to remember, I don't know. But for many years, he couldn't remember any details of the Beatles sessions. Just, broad details. Here he remembers every single time George screwed up a guitar solo. And that's one of the big problems. George comes off as such a crybaby, whiner, the least talented member of the group. Well, as I said, Ringo's hardly in it. And his guitar playing and musicianship really gets taken to task. There's an incident that he talks about in 1964. I don't know what role he had in 64, but they were recording I'll Follow the Sun. And George basically says, "Can I play the guitar solo? After all, I'm supposed to be the lead guitarist in the band." Geoff Emerick's opinion was that was very poor taste of George to say that. And when he played the solo, it was god-awful. It sounded like he was picking out notes. Well, I've heard, I don't know how many takes it took. According to the Lewison book, it didn't take that many. But the guitar solo on I'll Follow the Sun doesn't sound like he was picking out notes. It's a very simple guitar solo. Now, honestly, the Beatles were primitive musicians, and so were the Stones, and so were a lot of them. Paul is the one who really comes off as the best musician, the best overall songwriter, the best at everything. John, later on in the book, especially when he hooks up with Yoko, is, his ideas are bad, and he even criticizes I Am the Walrus, which George Martin actually praises. So the problem with the book that I had is that Paul comes off he comes off sometimes as an asshole, but he had to be an asshole. Because John and George were a bunch of whiny, gropey people. I mean, the incident with Obla Di Obla Da in the book is one that has been contradicted by Paul, and maybe Paul's being deliberately contrary. There's other incidents in the book, smaller incidents in the book. We find out from people like Ken Scott that Geoff Emerick interviewed other members of Abbey Road and took their memories as his own. Ken Scott was very vocal about the book, and Ken Scott did his own book. And in Ken Scott's book, he actually has the quotes from actual people that he interviewed, like producer Chris Thomas. And Ken Scott's book is not just about his time with the Beatles, it's about his time working with David Bowie, his time working with Supertramp, his time working with Missing Persons. And I felt his book was better, but Ken Scott really came out against the book, and also because Ken Scott did have a relationship with George. Ken Scott was working with George and archiving his whole catalog prior to George dying. So Ken Scott was really vocal about the book, and I've been vocal about it. It almost seemed like score settling, much in the same way Barry Miles's official biography of Paul McCartney many years from now was. I didn't find that book much of a biography, as more of a Barry Miles has some score to settle with John, and John in that book comes off as the least cultured person, not really as intelligent. Everything Paul has done, even his excursions into the avant-garde, which a lot of us haven't heard, are up there with John Cage and Edgar Varese pieces, whereas John is an amateur. So that book bothered me as well. But not so about Geoff Emerick's book. The result of Geoff Emerick's book, and this upset Geoff to no end, was total disconnection from the Beatles and the Beatles organization. I don't know how upset Paul was, but you know Olivia was upset, you know Yoko was upset, and you know that Ringo was upset. Geoff was not involved in the Love Project. Geoff voiced his displeasure with the Love Project, even though George Martin and his son Giles were a part of it. Geoff was not a part of the 2009 remasters, both mono and stereo. Geoff voiced his displeasure with not being included in that. Geoff was not a part of the Sgt. Pepper remix or the White Album remix and box set projects. And in fact, when George Martin was still alive, he started using Ken Scott for his seminars that he would give on Beatles and recording, because he was giving a lot of speeches and seminars, and he was calling Ken Scott to do it with him. Ken Scott, there was a listening party of the mono vinyl recordings at Electric Lady Studios in New York, and it was on YouTube. Ken Scott was the one who was talking about the mono mixes there. So they were using Ken Scott for a lot of stuff. It was only after Geoff died that they had all reached out and gave him his praise. And he does deserve praise for the innovations that he helped at the suggestions of the Beatles. But he was really trying to remake it that if George Martin was the fifth Beatle, then Geoff Emerick was the sixth Beatle. It was all because of his book that there was this total disconnection, and I could see that. I was shocked when I read how he was taking to task George and then eventually John in the book. But there was no fair and balanced portrayal of Paul in the book. I feel that if you're going to tell the whole story, you need to be fair and balanced. I mean, again, Paul comes off as a goody two-shoes in the book. He's the one that's got the plan, the man with the plan. And I'm sure part of that is true. But I was very disappointed in the book, and I could understand the controversy over it. Now, what are some of your thoughts on this? I know thoughts on this are varied. And again, this is not to disparage the great work Geoff did as an engineer, the way he mic'd Ringo's drums and the way he worked the board with George Martin. And, that's not to discredit his contributions. But his book was and is problematic. And unfortunately, even though he's passed, it's still going on with his estate and the 1962 audition tape. Give me some of your thoughts. Keep them professional. And I'll talk to you soon.